Joining us in this episode is the most qualified UK tax advisor, Rowan Morrow-McDade, who has 8 professional qualifications and is currently doing his 9th. In this episode, you'll get to hear Rowan's story of why and how he's got to this point, and you'll hear our views on what professional qualifications are essential for UK tax professionals and which ones would also be useful, dependent on specialism. You're listening to episode 104 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps tax professionals to progress, develop, and improve their careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. I was scrolling through LinkedIn one day when I saw the article about the most qualified UK tax advisor, and it was someone I already knew, Rowan. I knew he'd done quite a lot of qualifications, including CTA and audit, but I didn't realise the extent of them until I clicked onto his profile that day and I saw the massive list of qualifications. Some are tax specific, like ATT and CTA. Some cover tax to some degree, like STEP and being a chartered accountant. And some are not directly related to tax, but relate to areas that overlap with tax, like being a certified cryptocurrency expert because it's an area that Rowan gives tax advice in. Seeing the huge list of qualifications reminded me of when I considered doing another professional qualification on top of ATT and CTA that I already had. I was thinking of doing it as I thought it might benefit my career, but I decided against it because I just wasn't sure it would add much given my current qualifications, and frankly, I didn't want to face another exam. Whilst I was keen to hear Rowan's story for why and how he has become the most qualified UK tax professional, I also wanted to get his views around whether there is a limit whereby once you get further qualifications, it doesn't really benefit your career much more, whether your time is better spent in other areas instead of doing professional qualifications, and I wanted to get his views around which qualifications are essential and which ones are helpful, dependent on which area of tax you specialise in. I also know Rowan's had a few interesting gigs, like writing for Vogue, appearing on Times Radio, and addressing MPs on the loan charge, so you get to hear a bit about that too, including how he got these opportunities. Rough timings for each section of the episode can be found in the details section within your podcast player of choice, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP104.
Hi, I'm Maisie from Pro Tax Recruitment, and we are proud to sponsor the Tax Professionals podcast. At Pro Tax, we help tax professionals like you to find new roles that are a great fit to you, to find that perfect candidate to add to your team, and everything else in between. We focus solely on tax recruitment, and this allows us to give you current, informative insights into the tax market, helping you to make well-informed decisions. Head on over to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/pro-tax to see our latest tax roles and our team, all of whom would be happy to speak to you.
As I'm recording this, it's a few weeks after I finished delivering the May 2024 Tax Research Masterclass. About 2 weeks ago, I was on a Zoom call with Tammy, and Tammy attended the masterclass. She was telling me how happy she was to have found and have taken the masterclass. She was telling me it's drastically improved her efficiency, slashing the time it's taken her to find the answers to tax questions, and that it's helped her with interpretation of tax legislation. She is CTA qualified, but like most people, she didn't get to learn the skills around using legislation and doing research through the exams. She also shared a screen with me to show me some of the work that she's done based on a suggested homework exercise that I set, and she was telling me how much doing this exercise has helped her. It was really nice to know how much the masterclass has helped Tammy, and that all the time I've put into creating it and refining it to help others with tax research seems to be paying off, and Tammy was kind enough to leave me a recommendation on my LinkedIn page too. The next Tax Research Masterclass is currently scheduled for May 2025, but if you are interested in one before then please do message me, because if I do have enough interest, I will run one more in 2024. You can message me on LinkedIn or email. Both of these are in the show notes, along with a link to the full details of the masterclass. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. If you don't mind then, just to start us off, Rowan, could you just tell us a little bit about you and your tax career?
Sure, thanks, Jack. So I actually started off wanting to be a doctor, and I did work experience in a hospital and chose my A-levels based off that. Quickly realised I wasn't going into it for the right reasons. I was going into it because I thought it was a well-paid career and not really because I wanted to help patients. So I've always had an interest in money and economics. And so I pivoted at around 16 to a career in accounting and finance. So I then did a internal audit internship at Santander in London in 2011, which had quite a lot of financial statement audits. And I don't think there's anything wrong with audit, but I quickly realized audit wasn't for me. And I just couldn't see myself doing that for the next 40 years. And I think the big difference between tax and audit for me is that generally tax advisors are brought in because the client has an issue and wants you to help. And audit's a bit different because they're a requirement. I mean, there are exceptions, but I suspect if audits were not mandated, then far fewer audits would take place. So in around 2012, I did a tax module at university and two things came to mind. Firstly, I realized how little I knew about tax, like most people, dare I say. And secondly, how important and interesting tax is. So I applied for an internship at Deloitte in corporate tax, did that, and then got the graduate job there. So I spent around 3 years at Deloitte and I got invaluable experience. I think they're a great employer. But I think my colleagues would tell you I'm not necessarily the most corporate person. So after 3 years, I got the opportunity to set up a business with a friend of my father, buying and selling cars. So I was going to do all the finance and tax side of things. But because it was just two of us, I was also doing everything else. So that included going to the auctions, buying the cars, cleaning the cars, doing simple repairs, advertising cars, marketing the firm, etc. And the sort of business idea or the USP behind it was that because Manchester's a big international student city with lots of students that only have automatic licenses, we'd buy the automatic cars, sell them to the students at the beginning of the year, and then buy them back at the end of the year, do them up a bit, and then resell them to students. And the business plan largely worked, or it sort of worked, but we could never get a good supply of small automatic cars. So after about a year of doing that, in 2018, I joined a smaller firm of accountants and tax advisors in the city centre. We've got around 50 employees here, and it's called Alexander & Co. So I actually joined a mixed tax role, so I pivoted away from just doing corporate. So I did personal and corporate advisory, and I've been there ever since. And I've since expanded into doing trust work too. So I work, as I say, in an advisory capacity, but I also get involved in personal and corporate compliance when I'm needed.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you actually kind of had an idea what you wanted to do before you were even 16. That is quite an exception for most teens and, and young people. But I suppose you found out that the first thing that you tried to pursue was the wrong thing for you. So when was it you actually figured out that you wanted to try the audit thing? Was that 16 when you pivoted, did you say?
Yeah, so pivoted away from wanting to pursue a career in medicine to one in finance, accounting, tax. I mean, to be fair, I didn't really know much about tax or careers in tax at that point. And so I thought, well, I'll dip my toe in with audit, which was actually internal audit, but it's pretty similar, and realized, okay, I don't want to do audit. And then if I wanted to pursue the ACA, which I did, I thought, well, okay, well, let's try tax, and ended up really enjoying it.
No, fair enough. You did say as well at some point about like if audits weren't like mandatory, then there'd be a lot less people that had them. And I've had that same thought before, and I also think it makes it easier for, like, I suppose people to build an audit business because there's so many businesses out there that must have an audit. Whereas obviously us on the tax side, most businesses don't need advice. They need the compliance elements, but most don't need advice. There's some exceptions when you come to really large, but I think that makes it more difficult for us to win work because we're not seen as necessary. And a lot of people also don't understand the value that we can add, I don't think.
I completely agree. And the fact that quite often in an advisory capacity, you get brought in for, say, a transaction or a restructuring, and then that's it. That's the end of the relationship until 5 years later they do something else, whereas audits come around every single year, of course.
Yeah, it's double-edged sword, isn't it? Because it's hard for us to get recurring work as well. I mean, I've tried a few things that have helped a little bit with that in some cases, but a lot of clients won't need the recurring piece or don't want the recurring piece anyway because they don't think it's viable enough. But that's a topic for a different episode, I'm sure. So I suppose the reason we thought it'd be a good idea to this episode is because I saw the post on LinkedIn where you became the most qualified tax advisor or most qualified tax professional in the UK, which obviously is quite some achievement. And I didn't realise until I clicked into your profile like how many qualifications you actually had, because it pretty much fills up a page of A4 at this point, doesn't it? But like, why did you decide to do so many, and how did you kind of get to this point?
So I think if I'd stayed at Deloitte, I wouldn't have done what I've done. After 3 years at Deloitte, we were expected to specialize, and I didn't really want to specialize. So when I joined Alexander & Co. and realized actually I needed to be a well-rounded tax advisor, we don't have sort of, a capital allowance department or an R&D department or a trust and estate department, etc. We have to know at least to a preliminary level all of it. I thought, okay, I think these qualifications could really help me in terms of progressing my career and being able to better advise clients.
So then, what order did you do things in then? Did you start with ATT, then move to CTA? Like, what were like the first 3 or 4 that you did?
So it was ACA at Deloitte, then CTA at Alexander & Co. So CTA I absolutely loved. I think Advanced Technical Owner Managed Business is still my favourite exam ever. I'd do it every year if I could. And then once I passed that, and this was around 2018, 2019, I could see that the trend of the world, and it's been obviously happening for a long time, was being more international. So borders were less important. People were selling online, people were changing their residency, etc. So I decided to embark on the Advanced Diploma in International Taxation in early 2020. And that helped me progress in terms of people moving around, domicile, residency issues, all that kind of thing. What I didn't predict was COVID, as I don't think anybody else did. So I was meant to sit the exam in June 2020, and that got cancelled because of COVID. So I sat my first exam in November 2020. I sat my second exam in June 2021, and then should have sat my final exam in November 2021. And I was really prepared for it. I'd done all the tuition, I'd done the courses, I'd done the revision. One thing I hadn't actually done was book the exam. So yeah, by the time that I realised, it was too late. So I actually ended up sitting that in June 2022. So when your tutors urge you to book an exam and tell you the story about that one person that forgot to book their exam and ended up qualifying 6 months later than they should have done, that was me.
It's ironic as well, because obviously you'd done so many exams at that point, you'd have thought that would have been the easy bit.
Precisely. Yeah. I was pretty embarrassed, actually.
So then, like, what was the motivator then, do you think, behind keep doing more and more then? Because obviously I think, doing ACA first and then doing CTA, that makes complete sense to me, right? Because ACA is not focused on tax. You learn a bit, but it doesn't really teach you how to be an advisor, and it certainly doesn't go into depth. CTA turns you into I suppose, a tax advisor, or at least gets you into the mindset of what it means to be a tax advisor and, know a lot of rules in detail and so on. Audit, that bit also makes sense, I suppose, because it's directly tax related. But then I think most of the other ones aren't even tax related per se, are they? Like, there's one to do with cryptocurrency, for example, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I became a certified cryptocurrency expert because crypto was booming I suppose it's booming at the moment, but it was certainly booming in 2020, 2021. And I'd done quite a bit of crypto tax prior to that and thought, okay, actually I can become qualified in this and really understand the technology underlying it. And that's helped me get speaking gigs at various cryptocurrency festivals like Bitcoin Adventure in Bristol and CoinFest and stuff like that.
So then, like, what do you think was the thing that sat behind all of this then? Was it, for example, like career progression? Did you do it because you thought it would help with that? Did you do it because you just enjoyed exams? Because, I mean, you said that OMB was your favourite, like, exam out of all of them. And, not many people would ever say any CTA exams are remotely enjoyable, but there's you saying it's like one of the favourite things you could ever do. Like, what is it that, like, suppose drove you to keep doing more then?
So there's a few reasons, and partly for me, and I've stolen this phrase from somewhere online. It's not about the pursuit of happiness; it's the happiness of the pursuit. So it was never about I'm going to be happy once I got this qualification. I actually enjoyed doing them, learning more, being able to advise. And so I've actually just started partway through actually the new diploma in tax technology for the same reason. So I enjoy doing it, and it's not just about getting the letters after your name or the certificate at the end. And I feel like doing something that's hard to do is good in itself.
Yeah, I agree. And I enjoy learning too. See, I've thought before, like, I could say get the material one of these exams or whatever,
Mhm.
learn it, but just not sit the exam, because that's the thing that puts me off it. Like, it's that pressure in like the month before where you basically spend loads of time doing it.
Mhm.
And there's those nights that you don't want to do anything because you just want a bit of a break, but you feel like you've got to push through. And I'm someone that also likes learning, but I get to that point, when it comes to the exams. I
Yeah.
suppose, what do you think is that as an option then? Because it sounds like in your case, you're saying you're not bothered about the letters or even the qualification necessarily, but it's more so the process of learning something new.
Yeah, I'd actually say I'm a little bit the opposite to you. So I actually like the pressure of the exam. I like knowing, okay, I'm going to have to learn this. And that gives me motivation to go through all the books, do all the question practice. I
Yeah.
find it much more difficult with, for example, the diploma in taxation technology. There isn't actually a set date where you have to sit the exams. Whereas if you've got a CTA exam or an audit exam or a STEP exam, there is a final date by which you need to know everything.
Yeah. It doesn't make me do bad, by the way, with the pressure. Like it does, I do exactly what you do, which is, work towards it. But because I'm such an obsessive with these things, I'm literally thinking about it like all the time. I'm lying in bed thinking about it. I wake up thinking about it.
Mm.
And sometimes I used to spend time doing things that weren't even particularly beneficial for the exam itself, but, were beneficial for the wider sake of my career, like looking in the legislation to get to the bottom of something, for example,
Mm.
like answering some of the other students' questions on the Tollis forum, which my tutor
Yeah.
at the time found hilarious, I think, because she'd never seen anyone else do that before.
I've never seen
But
anyone do that apart from the tutor, but there you go.
yeah, no, I did for the human capital one, because it was the area I worked in as well, and it was just another excuse to make sure I knew something or to figure it out if I didn't already.
No, I get that. And I guess another motivation for me is that we've got like a partner here and a director who are much better tax advisors than me. They've got, I think, 30 years experience each. And I thought that I didn't want to wait 30 years to get their level of knowledge and expertise. They probably wouldn't need to sit these exams because they've mostly seen them in practice. But I thought, there's no way that I'm waiting 30 years to have seen all of these bits and bobs that I've learned in practice. So I thought I could supercharge my knowledge by doing all these exams.
Yeah, accelerate it, speed it up. And do you think it did that then? Do you feel like it did help
Yeah,
with that?
I feel like it did. Yeah, definitely. The sometimes, so I've advised on, say, trust and estate planning in the past and inheritance tax planning, and this was before I did the STEP qualification. But once I did the STEP qualification, I thought, wow, there was so much that I didn't know that I didn't know. And that was almost a little bit scary for me. So I don't think any of the advice they ever gave was wrong as such. It was all been reviewed, etc. But I would just realize that there was so much extra that potentially I could have advised on and I didn't.
Mm-hmm. So it's obviously benefited your career in that way, that in terms of getting you more knowledge more quickly. I mean, you have like less gaps or blind spots, if you want to call it that. Like, how else would you say the qualifications have benefited your tax career then?
I think that being able to market myself to some extent. So I had a call from somebody that referred and that was a referral from an IFA. And she goes, hello, am I speaking to the UK's most qualified tax advisor? And I said, he's Rowan. You can call me Rowan, but yes. So I think that has helped.
Yeah, and I suppose that was probably an unexpected consequence of it, right? Because how do you even know, by the way, that you're the most qualified? Like, how do you check that?
So I did email the Chartered Institute of Taxation and see if anybody else had all the qualifications, and they said not as far as they were aware. And then I have also looked online, because all of the bodies will say, if you're a member of CTA, you can find a member of CTA. Same with the ACA, same with the STEP, same with the audit, etc. And there isn't anybody else with all the qualifications.
Yeah. So have you gone through every single 10,000 members?
Not quite, but yeah, I've had a look.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So then I thought it would be good to debate, I suppose, around whether it's worthwhile people doing more qualifications, or whether it's worthwhile spending their time elsewhere. Like, just before we sat down and started recording this, like I was saying, we've almost taken two different paths, because I did consider doing ACA after CTA, but the thing for me that stopped me is that I just really couldn't be bothered to sit another exam. And so I went down the different path to you, which is I suppose working on my soft and tax skills, but not necessarily my tax knowledge. But I think that's because I always felt like my technical knowledge was always good, and that was like my strength area, so I focused on the other areas. Whereas obviously what you've done instead is you haven't necessarily focused on those things, but you might have learned it through experience. You decided to focus on getting more technical knowledge instead in the grand scheme of things. So like where do you stand overall then for this? Because you've done so many now, and it sounds like a lot of the motivation was enjoyment, I suppose, and wanting to learn. But like, do you think you've done too many, like past the point where it's actually not beneficial anymore? It's just enjoyable for you?
Well, I think that there have to be a commercial reason behind all of my qualifications because my firm has paid for them all. So I've had to justify the cost to them. But I also think just in terms of my lifestyle, although I work sort of relatively late, let's say I finish at 7, that still gives me, say, 4 hours before I go to bed. And likewise at the weekends, even if I'm playing tennis or going to the gym or whatever, I still might have 4 or 5 hours spare a day. And for me, it's like, why not just spend that time being productive? Why not actually do something instead of scrolling through Instagram or watching Netflix? And don't get me wrong, I do that as well. But I feel like actually, when you think about it, you have an awful lot of spare time. So why not do something that you enjoy and is going to help your career?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Do you think then, I don't know, let's say you did 6 qualifications instead of, is it 9 you've got overall? Or am I making that up?
2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. 8.
Oh, 8. So if you'd have done like 6 instead of 8, I completely get what you're saying about like it's a good use of time for you rather than sitting, don't know, watching TV or going through TikTok or whatever it is. But do you think getting those extra 3 has made like a big difference to your career and your progression?
I would say so. And if it hasn't made a big difference yet, then I think it will do. So these qualifications that I've done, which I've spent, the last sort of 10 years doing, 14 if you include my degree, I will have for the rest of my life. I'll have these for the next 30 years. They're not going to get taken off me. So I think that they have benefited me so far because, again, I can advise on a really wide range of tax topics. But my hope is that they'll continue to benefit me going forward.
Yeah. Maybe on the flip side then, let's maybe look at it in a slightly different way. Because obviously you could have spent that time that you spent on the qualification doing something else that could have benefited your career instead. Like, I don't know, working on becoming better at providing advice or maybe better at presenting or public speaking, for example. Do you think there's a possibility that those things could have reaped more rewards for your career than doing more qualifications?
It's hard to know. It's a what if. Potentially, yes. But from my perspective, when, for example, a client comes in, quite often clients don't actually know what their tax problems are. And it's often said that tax advisors solve problems clients didn't know they had in a way that they don't understand. And while that's not quite true, you have to be able to identify tax problems. And a lot of taxes will obviously interact with each other.
Yeah.
So let's say that I've got a client that says, Rowan, I've got a £400,000 profit. I want to save corporation tax. Well, I could say, okay, put through a £400,000 salary. There you go. You've saved 100,000 in corporation tax. But that's not really good planning. I need to understand, okay, if you put through a £400,000 salary, then will that work? Firstly, from an individual perspective, secondly, from a company perspective.
Yeah. So there's no doubt, for example, that you obviously have got a much broader tax knowledge than me. So if you speak to a client, whether it's a corporate or an individual, you will definitely pick up on more things than what I would. In employment taxes, though, obviously that's where I will pick up pretty much everything, basically.
Yep.
And
I wouldn't.
Again, I think you would pick up some stuff in that area, but wouldn't pick up as much as me. So that's I suppose where having these extra qualifications, in your case, particularly the tax ones, help because you're a mixed tax person rather than a specialist. So could that have been a different avenue for you instead? Then could you become more specialist, for example, or did you actively not want to become specialist and you'd rather be in a mixed tax person? It sounds like you'd rather be a mixed tax person based on liking OMB so much, for example.
Precisely, yeah. And with OMBs, as I say, they've got complicated tax affairs, and sometimes they don't really know which tax is important to them. So I don't really want to become a specialist, partly because there's nothing that I like enough to think, right, I want to do that for the next 30 years of my life. And I also like the variety that I get with having a mixed tax role.
Yeah. It's definitely different strokes, because you must have different problems to the problems I have, I suppose, being a specialist. But I'm guessing you have your own too, because you can never know everything about every tax, can you? So does that mean every time you work on a project, it takes you a bit longer than what it would if you were a specialist in that area? I'm guessing it would.
Definitely.
But like on the flip side, then what do you think of the benefits of being mixed and so broad?
Yeah, definitely. So if a client came in and was talking about, say, corporation tax and employment tax, corporation tax, I'm pretty comfortable with, but the employment tax, if they wanted a report from me, it might take me, a week or something to do it, because I don't see it all day, every day like you do. Particularly, say it's a recruitment business in the employment tax. Well, you would probably just know the answers straight away. I'd spend a couple of days researching it, and then I might not even be sure that I got it right.
Yeah. And that's the risk, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. And also there's things then that you potentially won't know about in terms of like a savings opportunity, in the employment tax space. But then obviously you will be able to do better in other spaces, like across corporation tax and probably VAT and personal taxes. You would, well, I have no doubt you'd do a better job than me at advising across all range of those. But yeah, there's pros and cons of both, isn't there, I suppose? I used to hate being specialist early on, for similar reasons to what you're saying now. But I suppose where it changed for me was when I could see how much time it would save me once I knew what the answer was to certain things, how much more you can, I suppose, bill when you're an absolute specialist in that area, because you can add more value the more you know about something, particularly when it's like really niche. I've seen that a lot in the recruitment sector. And therefore I felt like I was getting better bang for my buck, I suppose, feeling like I was more valuable per hour of time that I spent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember sitting in a meeting with a corporation tax specialist at Deloitte, and the client asked them what is a relatively simple personal tax question, and the partner didn't know the answer. And at the time I thought that's fine. They don't know the answer. They had to call in a personal tax person. But again, I didn't know much about personal tax at that point. But then, as I've grown up and become more mature, I thought, wow, that's quite interesting that they're so specialised that they don't know what to me was a relatively basic question about. It was about temporary non-residence rules for individuals.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. And in some ways, that could maybe even be potentially embarrassing for that partner in that situation, But maybe because they're used to it, I suppose, that being the norm for them, that maybe they were fine about it. It's hard to say.
Yeah, they seem fine about it. They just said, "Oh no, that's a personal tax question."
Yeah, because a lot of people don't know, when they come to a tax person, they just think you do all tax, probably in all countries around the world. Is what they say in time.
Yeah. Tell me about what the inheritance tax rate is in Slovenia or sometimes.
Yeah.
No idea.
To see our latest tax rolls at ProTax, along with our friendly team who's more than happy to speak to you, head on over to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/pro-tax.
So since you've done so many qualifications anyway, then I thought it'd be nice to get your view as well in terms of like what's essential in terms of qualification for working tax, in your view at least. And then also maybe we can go through a few different specialisms and see what we think are the essential qualifications to do, and maybe the ones that are useful to do too.
Yeah, of course. So I think ATT or CTA, and then alongside ACA, I think ATT or CTA is really important. Although I'm saying that, I have seen some people tend to be older that have no tax qualifications whatsoever, and they've been very proficient advisors. Although I think that generation is sort of dying out largely. I don't know if you found the same.
Yeah, well, I suppose they had less tax when they would have started as well, less tax rules. So there was less to know about. And then over the years, they've just accumulated knowledge over time, which is, I suppose, makes sense. You can't really do that nowadays because there's so much to know. The only thing I would say, so I agree generally, by the way, with saying ACA is also useful, but I think there's exceptions to that. I don't think it adds anything at all for someone who works in employment taxes. I also don't think it adds much at all for people who work in VAT, corporation tax, personal tax, partnership tax, mixed tax, all those things. I think it does. The only thing I would say, obviously you've done ACA, I haven't, but the only exam I think might be relevant for all tax people is the stuff to do with like financial statements and stuff, just so you can at least read them and know what they mean.
Yeah. No, I broadly agree with that. I think particularly when you're advising corporates, it's important to know what the impact of your advice is going to have on the accounts.
Yeah. I think that bit's useful, but the more wide ACA stuff, I just can't see it being relevant. Like something to do with audit and assurance and whatever stuff, like that's just never going to be beneficial to the vast majority of tax advisors, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. There's bits of ACA which I've literally never used. The stuff like hedging, the treasury things that you have to go through in quite a lot of detail, I've literally never used, and I suspect I never will use.
Yeah. This is where I think it'd be nice, where you could like just do a few of the exams and they can like then give you a certificate or something to show that you've at least done that.
Yeah.
I know it's not as good as saying you're ACA qualified, but you can waste a lot of time learning stuff you don't need to know about, like I suppose what you've ended up doing with ACA than if you've never used some things.
Yeah, well, interestingly, you can do that for CTA. So if you want to sit an advanced technical for fun or for as a means to an end, you can literally just ask them to sit an advanced technical, not as part of the CTA program.
Yeah.
So I know, because I sat a CTA, the Inheritance Tax and Trust, to get an exemption from the step, because I just love the CTA exams. I think they're really comprehensive. So I just said, can I sit that just for fun? Well, it's obviously not for fun, and the CIOT said, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, that's good to know. I don't think can you do the same in ACA? I think you can get like a certificate for doing all like the basic or foundation level or whatever it's called, and then you can get a certificate for the next step. I don't think you can for individual exams, can you?
Class, I'm not sure. I suspect not. I've certainly not seen it advertised.
Yeah, no, me neither. But I think that could potentially be useful. But yeah. I've seen some like employment tax jobs like for graduates where they do advertise ACA as like the starting thing, and I always think that's such a waste, because they'd get a lot more from doing the human capital advanced technical paper very early on in their career.
Oh, well, much more.
Yeah, much more. I almost think actually that the employers could probably prioritise the exams, which one's done first, better than what they do, I suppose. Because like for employment tax, and I'm going off on a slight side tangent here, but for employment tax, there's not much compliance work, because you basically get P11Ds and PSAs that come around once a year at the same time, which is slightly annoying. And outside of that, they need to get involved in advisory projects, but it's so hard to get people involved in advisory stuff until they've got like a bit of a breadth of knowledge in employment taxes. And the only way they can really get that quickly, I think, is by doing the human capital exam.
Yeah.
But frustratingly, you can't do the CTA until you're ATT qualified. So you have to go through the rigmarole of doing ATT first.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get to that point where you're about 18 months to 2 years experience, and then they can finally sit the human capital paper. But I just think that's too late for people, a lot of people. In some ways, maybe they just need to introduce a human capital paper for the ATT route.
It would be a good idea. We have something similar with our graduates. So we make them do personal tax compliance, so personal tax returns, and corporate tax compliance, largely before we bring them into advisory, on the basis that whatever they are advising ultimately will end up on a tax return at some point. So it's really important to understand the basis of the tax returns and the corporation tax returns before they go into the advisory project.
Yeah. I think that's very normal, isn't it, for corporation tax? There must be very few roles where you can start in corporation tax advisory. You would usually start doing compliance work first and then build from there, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I certainly would have thought so. It can be very difficult to bring people straight into advisory without knowing the sort of underlying rules that underpin all of tax.
Yeah. So your situation then, mixed tax, you're saying that you think ACA, CTA, and potentially audit is...
Yeah, audit comes in quite useful. So any sort of international tax inquiry that comes through our website or often through referrals, then I will deal with. I wouldn't say it's essential. Although, as I say, the world is becoming more international. There was a blip during COVID when obviously people couldn't move around so much, etc. But it's happening again. There's people always flying off to Dubai. There's clients in Gibraltar, people with complicated tax affairs around the world. So it's really useful for me to be able to know at least the UK tax impact of their movements.
Yeah. So ACA, CTA, essential in your view, audit, helpful.
Yeah. I would say that audit helpful if you do stuff with international. If it's just UK based clients, then maybe not. But even then, often our UK based clients, as they're expanding, they want to go overseas. And so if they come up to you and say, I want to go overseas, and you just shrug your shoulders and say, I don't know what the tax impact of that is, it's not very useful to the client.
Yeah. What about the technology diploma, then the tax technology diploma? Do you think that's helpful or just interesting? Where would you put it for you as a mixed tax person?
At the moment, it's interesting. I'd say it will be helpful. There's quite a lot of programming, AI. Well, obviously it's technology. My thinking is that AI could really help the tax profession. I know you've had a few AI enthusiasts on this podcast before, and they've had really interesting things to say. So I want to make sure that when AI does replace us all, if ever it does, I'm sort of on top of it.
Yeah. Employment tax, then, I'm going to say that ATT, CTA, essential. I think audit could be helpful if you work on the global mobility side of things.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not gonna add much. Corporation tax, ACA, CTA, probably through the joint pathway.
Yeah, I would say so. ACA and the CTA, yeah.
International tax, what would you say there? Would you say add it over CTA or both? It's essential.
Probably audit. So a lot of the CTA that international, so that it's generally covered in taxation of major corporates. Actually, I think it's got a different name now. Taxation of larger groups or something like that.
Taxation of large corporates and groups, maybe.
That's it. Yeah. So it's changed names. I'm showing my age here. All of that is effectively covered by audit. So you could just do audit, I would have thought. Although, again, having ACA as a backbone is always useful, particularly if you did the IFRS version, so the International Financial Reporting Standards version of ACA.
Okay. Just on this on around audit then and CTA. So you obviously done both. I've heard that the audit isn't as good, for example, helping you, I don't know, use legislation as CTA is, for example. Now, I don't think CTA is particularly helpful, but at least, it can be as a side consequence of it. So do you feel like you don't get certain scores by just doing the audit that you do by doing CTA?
Yes, I would say so. So audit is quite a lot of essay-based work. It's much less computationally heavy than the CTA. And I think there's definitely less legislation in audit than there is in CTA. So I think, potentially you would be missing out on that. And
what about for VAT people then? I'm thinking probably ATT, CTA is essential, ACA and audit is helpful.
Yeah, I agree. There's actually only a small amount of VAT in audit, or at least on the papers that I sat. And I think CTA have a VAT specialism route, as far as I'm aware. Yeah,
I think it might be indirect taxes, but yeah, they definitely do some cross-border stuff in that. So there's probably not much more you can get from audit, I suppose, then.
No, I wouldn't have thought so.
Yeah. Personal tax people then. So I've always thought for them, ATT, CTA, and STEP is essential. Well, sorry, the first two essential, STEP, helpful.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. I'd say that STEP is very useful for personal tax people.
Is that more so useful for people, though, that go down, I suppose, almost specialise in inheritance tax or do a lot of work there? Or can it be helpful more widely than that?
I think it's helpful more widely than that, because quite often if you're doing a piece of personal tax advisory, it can affect their inheritance tax position. And you need to be at least be aware that it could affect their inheritance tax position and ways to plan around it.
Yeah. And so in STEP then, do you actually learn about inheritance tax as part of that, or do you just learn about like trusts and similar things?
So STEP has become more flexible now. So you don't have to learn about, so I, for example, don't really know anything about the legalities behind trusts. Obviously, I have an awareness of it, but I chose effectively a tax route through STEP. So I ended up doing almost all tax modules as part of STEP. So, for example, I couldn't draft a trust deed, but I can advise on the tax impacts of trusts and inheritance tax.
Yeah. So if you've got a client, you can say, I advise you get this trust, then you'd have to go to a lawyer or someone else to set it up. But then, you've given you advice on the tax part of it. Someone's got it set up and it all links together.
Yeah. And just for what it's worth, I found quite a lot of private client lawyers have a unbelievable lack of knowledge about tax.
Oh, don't get me started on this, because I have the exact same thing with employment lawyers. It is really bad. Really, really bad.
Yeah. I'm sometimes when they're doing, will trusts or lifetime trusts, and they don't actually know the tax impact of that. To me, I'm thinking, how can you possibly properly advise a client if you don't understand the tax impact of what you're
No,
doing? Okay,
I
yes,
know.
you can understand the legality of it and who the trustees can be and what happens if a trustee dies. Fine,
Well,
but where's
yeah, like this example for me. So it was one of the last jobs I did at Danes just before I left. I kind of took it on because I thought it'd be interesting as well as potentially useful, I suppose, for the client. So for the first time ever, I actually advised an individual as opposed to an employer, and the individual was on the receiving end of a settlement agreement, and so they were keen to set it up. I suppose first off, they wanted to make sure that the right amount of tax was being paid. Then, as part of that, I said, "Well, I reckon you could set this up tax efficiently." So when we did I did a project with a bit of support from a colleague on that, and I remember being on a Teams meeting with her employment lawyers first, and just the suggestion from me that there could be some planning done. They
Mhm.
thought I was a charlatan. You could just see it all over the face. They thought I was full of rubbish. Honestly, like I could see it all over the face, and so I had some convincing to do, I think. So I ended up sending them like one page of a book that I'd got some useful information from, just to be like, look, you can do stuff here. Like I'm not making this stuff up. I then spoke to the employer's lawyers. They equally thought I was a charlatan, and it was just really shocking. And it started making me think, like, am I delusional about this? Like, is this just me or is it them? But I got a phone call about a week ago, and they'd had a 180K tax refund. So,
Oh, right.
but
Congratulations.
it's just proving the point that a lot of lawyers that are not tax lawyers really don't know that much about tax. And that's really surprising. I think employment lawyers, for example, should know about the tax consequences
Mhm.
of termination payments, or at least seek advice as part of helping people with that process, because it's a massive, massive gap if they're not. And the other thing I've seen them do a lot, I'm slightly ranting here now because it does annoy me. They
Mhm.
tend to put in the agreements with employees something like, we agree that this payment is tax free. Well, I could agree with my employer that my whole salary is tax free, but it's not. You know what I mean? You can't just
Why haven't you
agree
thought of that?
something. You know what I mean? And it always makes me laugh every time I see it, and it's just an absolutely ridiculous scenario. But yeah, it sounds like
Yeah,
you've seen the exact same thing
I
as
have.
me, then just in a different area.
But then again, I'm just wondering now if private client lawyers sit around and think, can't believe these tax advisors are advising on trusts without knowing the intricate legal details of it. Who knows?
Yeah, well, maybe. But it sounds like that's a shortfall of yours in this case, and so therefore you wouldn't do that.
Yes, yeah. When someone says, "Oh, what's the process for replacing a trustee?" I'd say, "No idea. Not my area. Nor
Yeah.
do I want to advise on that." But I certainly can tell you about the tax aspect of it.
But you certainly wouldn't give them a contract that says, sign this, it says, we agree, this is how you do it.
No, absolutely not. No, no. Very clear of where my job stops and where the lawyers need to come in.
Yeah, I know there's other tax categories that we've not talked about, but the last one I've kind of noted down for now, because I think these are like, we're almost covering like the key tax specialisms, if you want to call it that. Tax investigations. I actually don't think there's any essential qualification for them. Maybe if they went down the HMRC route, it's probably essential to get whatever qualification they give inspectors or can put inspectors on. But I don't think CTA or ATT or anything else really is essential for them. I don't know what your thoughts are around that.
I would have thought CTA would be beneficial, but I don't. I must say I don't deal a huge amount in tax investigations. So again, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think maybe it could be helpful. I don't think it would fall in the essential category. What a lot of tax investigations people do, from what I can tell anyway, is kind of almost manage the inquiry, but then go get the tax expertise input from people who have the specialisms in those areas. I
Yeah,
think the exception to that is people who deal with personal tax stuff and like COP9 inquiries, for example.
yeah.
I think they do know about those tax areas, but I think more broad tax investigations people probably don't.
Yeah, that's true. Although saying that, we've like everybody else in the industry have had quite a lot of R&D tax investigations recently.
Yeah.
So had to learn quite a lot. And in the R&D tax investigations, you do need to know the underlying R&D rules and where HMRC are being difficult in their application of the R&D guidelines and indeed their own manuals.
Yeah, I think it's the exact same with employment tax inquiries, to be fair. I think tax investigations people tend to not really get involved in employment tax ones. It tends to be dealt with by the employment tax specialist instead. But for example, corporation tax or personal tax, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think tax investigations people tend to deal with those more than, say, the corporation tax or the personal tax advisor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Precisely that. We when tax investigations get really complicated, we do actually refer it out on occasion.
Yeah, yeah, and that's sensible.
Really
the thing I think we should probably do more, and I'm probably guilty of this, is knowing when to get like a solicitor or a barrister potentially involved in it. And the thing I'm still not particularly clear on in my head is when you should probably go to a tax investigation specialist or a barrister, for example, instead. Like that's such a blurry line to me.
Yeah.
When I spoke to people about it in the past on the podcast, they basically just said, "Oh, you should probably have both," but most clients can't afford to have both. So which one's like more appropriate in one circumstance?
Well, precisely. And from the client's perspective, they wouldn't know when they needed a barrister or a solicitor, nor really would they want to pay for one.
No,
so
definitely.
They probably assume, and quite rightly, that if you're a tax advisor, you can deal with a tax investigation.
Yeah.
You're then
I think we
saying
should. I mean, I think one bit actually that's missing from CTA on this note is I think there should be something more about tax investigations. Maybe how to deal with them, what HMRC's powers are.
Absolutely.
Like the charter, any limits, what they're allowed to do legally, all these type of things. I think that would be really useful in the CTA, but I think they might sprinkle little bits of that throughout the syllabuses of different exams, but I don't think they cover any of it in great detail. That might be because I never did any of the ones where they did that, but they certainly didn't do it for employment taxes.
Yeah, there's bits in OMB about things like accelerated payment notices, but not in a huge detail.
Yeah, although when I did OMB, it was more so down the route of this is when one can be issued, rather than if you've got one, how would you deal with the investigation? You know what I mean?
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. Whereas I think that's the bit that's missing is this has happened. How do you negotiate or deal with HMRC, all that type of stuff. I suppose it's the dispute resolution element of it that I think's missing.
Yeah, precisely. And we've got an R&D investigation at the moment that's going to ADR, alternate dispute resolution. And again, it's something that I know very little about, apart from listening to podcasts and such like. It's not something that and again we're not dealing with it because of that.
Yeah. Then that's probably exhausted that element then around the debates. I think I understand more now why you've done so many of them, I suppose. I think I'm still more on the side overall that once you get past the certain point, it's probably more beneficial to do something else. But I think it's not like, for example, what I've done, spend time on soft skills and similar. But saying that, I think it's going to depend on the person. And if it's someone like you that enjoys doing it, there is obviously a side consequence of doing it too that's beneficial to your career on top of the enjoyment and all those other good bits. Although I don't think many people will have the persistence and the patience that you do to do as many as you have done.
No, but potentially true. One thing that I heard tutors say when I was doing this, quite a few exams, they were like, tax is all about application, and to me that's rubbish. Tax is about knowledge, and then you need to apply it. So if you're in a meeting with a non-domiciled client and they're talking about bringing money to the UK and you don't know about business investment relief, then there's no way that you can apply that knowledge. You're just not going to be able to advise the client properly.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I'm going to have to be careful what I say here, because I put a post out recently on LinkedIn and I mentioned about the course providers tending to advise 3 months on. That's how long you should spend studying for the exam, 3 months before you sit it. And I think it should be a lot longer than that. And so one person from the course provider came back and said, I think that's a bit unfair on the course providers as part of a wider post. But she agreed that people should start earlier than 3 months. But the point of the post was not to slate the course providers. It was to make the point that people should start really early, like 5 months before in reality.
Absolutely. And when I'm talking to the graduates or other people and advising them about the exam strategy and stuff, I know it's often people say, if the pass rate is 50 and you get 55%, then you've wasted your time for 5%. And again, I just think that's rubbish, because you're not studying medieval history or something that's completely unrelated to your job. If you don't study part of the syllabus, then it comes up in practice. You're not going to know it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think we've got a very similar ethos around doing the qualifications itself. For me, it was never about the letters at the end, but obviously I did want them. It was always about building the knowledge
Mm.
and I suppose setting myself up for the rest of my career, and getting 50% wasn't really going to do that.
No.
That's probably why I spent so much time actually using legislation. I spent way too much time when I was studying, going through legislation. I just did. But in different ways, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Because I don't think there's many people out there now that aren't legally trained that are as good at tax research as I am. And that might sound somewhat arrogant, but it's just what I've experienced in real life,
Well, and now you run the tax research masterclass, which I presume at least partly stemmed from all that work that you did initially.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was because I saw so many people not doing it well, and I thought there's a massive gap here. People need to know how to do this. But because there's so many tax professionals out there that I suppose have gotten away without being able to do it really well, people think it's not essential. But I just think if people learn how to do it, it's going to reap so much benefit for your career. You'll progress quicker. You'll be able to provide better advice. There's just loads of side consequences, I think, of being good at doing tax research.
Absolutely, and there's quite a few firms, and I'm not going to name names because we've interviewed people from other firms, and they'll sort of basically know the rules as they've maybe read them in a textbook, but they've never actually opened the legislation. And I'm thinking, surely you're massively exposing yourself, because if you've never read the legislation and you just assumed that the rule was always going to be the same because you've read it, then you're going to expose yourself. You're going to potentially get sued at some point.
Yeah, no, I agree. I had a slightly weird situation. It's kind of the moment I realised that a lot of people don't use the ledge as much as they should or as well as they should. It was to do with corporation tax. So I'm not going to get this perfectly right because it's not my area and it was a long time ago now, but it was something to do with a corporation tax deduction for employees that were having either client entertaining or staff entertaining, one of the two. There's a deduction laid in one side, isn't there, not on the other? You probably know the answer to it. I can't remember. But whatever way around it was. So I had a situation where there was a group of companies. There was one company in the group paying for the entertaining, and there was employees from other group companies that were going to it. And I think technically, if you read the ledge, or for that situation, that the deduction didn't apply unless they're actually employed by that company. And this other advisor that I was speaking to just said, "Oh, but we've just always done it that way." They'd never checked. They were a senior manager with like 10 plus years experience, CTA qualified, and they'd never checked the ledge on such a basic point. It's like one of the most common deductions for corporation tax I can imagine.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so it happens all the time, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's completely not uncommon when we're talking about people doing, for example, a simple share for share exchange, and they've done loads of them, and they've never actually read the legislation. They've never read what the legislation says that they're allowed to do. They've filled out a template.
Yeah, I find it just shocking. But I mean, on the flip side, there are people out there that have great careers that never really use ledge much, for example. But I just think they could have been such a better advisor personally if they did. There's the amount of times I've come up with a quirky interpretation to, I suppose, bat HMRC away for clients, or to justify that there's not a past liability. It's happened so many times. And that termination payment situation I talked about earlier, there's no way that I could have got that or helped get that 180k refund without being able to use ledge, without being able to do a good piece of research. It just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, and I'm sure you're aware that HMRC manuals don't always reflect exactly what the legislation says, although they're set out in a very easy to read way.
They're necessarily easy to read, but yes, agreed overall.
Yeah.
So outside of being the most qualified tax advisor, then, so you've had a few interesting gigs, if that's the right word to describe it. So you've been on Times Radio, you've been interviewed by Vogue, you've addressed the MPs on the loan charge. Like, how did you get these opportunities then? Was it because you'd done so many qualifications, or was it through other means?
It's actually largely through social media. So I've always had an interest in tax itself. And so when I find something like an interesting point about tax, then I think to myself, oh yeah, that sounds quite interesting. I could make a post about that. If I find that interesting, other people are probably going to find that interesting. And that's not always the case. Something that I find very interesting, often other people don't find interesting, but often they do. So I've been posting about like loan charge in terms of the tax impact and indeed the social impact of the loan charge for a while. And then the all-party parliamentary group for the loan charge got in touch and said, can you come and speak to the MPs at Westminster about this? And that was actually through a Twitter post that I'd made, or several Twitter posts actually. And it was the same with the Vogue article, or the Vogue interview that I did, and that was about the new Airbnb or Vinted or eBay tax, as it was called, which it actually wasn't a new tax.
No, yeah, I had my friends ask me about that as well, actually. I'm like, I don't think this is new, I just think they haven't been declaring stuff.
Precisely that, and so there's so much misinformation out there, and indeed, I'm sure you're aware in employment tax as well. There's a lot of misinformation on places like Twitter and even in large media outlets. I think the Sun made a post or an article about the new tax, as they called it. Again, it wasn't a new tax. It was platform reporting regulations. It was simply passing information from these online platforms to HMRC that wasn't previously done.
Yeah. See, I didn't know. Obviously, it's not my area. I didn't really pay that much attention to it, but I thought as much. I thought they were just gathering information so that people would actually have to disclose what they should have already been disclosing.
Precisely, yeah. It wasn't a new tax at all. And in terms of the social media, I'm still sort of playing around with it, I want to say. So sometimes I'll spend ages writing a post, and I think, oh, this is really good. They find it really interesting, and it'll get no traction whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then other times, that like the one that actually led to the article for Vogue, I wrote it in about 3 minutes. Someone had posted a load of misinformation on Twitter, so I just tweeted them and said, actually, no, this is what's happened. And this post blew up. It got something like, it's my most popular post ever. It's got sort of 250,000 views. And then other ones that I've spent, hours crafting and changing words and moving them, changing commas, etc. No one cares about.
Yeah.
So I'm still working on it.
I found the exact same thing, and the only explanation I can put behind it is I think that if your post comes across too polished, it doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel like what you would be like in real life. Whereas if you draft one in like 3 minutes, it's probably more close to how you would speak it, and therefore people tend to connect to it more. Maybe that's the only explanation I can have behind it. To be fair, but yeah,
never thought about that. You might well
see.
Be right.
I put a post out last week, and I think it's got a typo in the first line, and I couldn't edit it on my phone, but it's still got decent traction, like quite a lot of comments, got like quite a lot of likes, but it had a typo in the first line.
Oh dear. Well,
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how the algorithms work either, because some posts seem to get boosted, and other posts just completely die. But
yeah, it's funny, isn't it? The ones that you think would do well don't, and the ones that you just do off the cuff tend to do well for some reason. Yeah, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense, does it? But you just go to show there's no point spending loads of time crafting a post then necessarily.
Yeah, precisely. And I enjoy writing about tax anyway. Again, it's something that I think tax is super interesting. I know not everybody agrees, and the people that don't agree are a bit strange. But I think it's something that everybody can benefit from learning about.
Yeah, for sure. It is interesting actually knowing that you've gotten all these, it sounds like all of them anyway, through Twitter now X, rather than LinkedIn. Because obviously I'm solely on LinkedIn. I have got a Twitter account, but I don't use it. But
yeah,
that seems to be where you get like the interesting experiences and opportunities then, because it's people who are outside of tax engaged with those posts, whereas on LinkedIn you're probably mainly getting only tax people engaged with your posts.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And then once like with Times Radio, once I went on once, they've asked me back. They asked me back, and then I think I've got another one coming up, and I've also got the Kaplan career YouTube, which is getting filmed next month, and that was through LinkedIn actually, thinking about it, but that's more tax focused rather than sort of general media.
Yeah. And so those things really, none of them would have happened without social media, though. It's good to know, isn't it? Because people out there, I suppose, particularly people early on, like even just starting to post something that you might think is fairly trivial can lead something big in the future. The hardest thing with social media, though, is you don't know what you're going to get from your effort. It might be nothing. And that's like what puts a lot of people off, I think.
It is. And I've had the Twitter account since 2018. I was posting maybe every week or so since 2018, and I got nothing from it at all for about 4 years. Nothing. Maybe even longer than that. And then just this sort of past year or so, it started to do quite well.
Good on the persistence. If people want to learn more about it, then where are the best places for them to go? Is it LinkedIn? Is it Twitter? Is it somewhere else?
Yeah, so LinkedIn and Twitter. So on LinkedIn it's just Rowan Morrow-McDade, and on Twitter it's Rowan M McDade.
When I was editing this episode, I realised how much I kept interrupting and cutting Rowan off during our conversation. Sorry about that. I think it's because I was enjoying the conversation too much, but fortunately the episode has still come out well. It's good to get a different perspective to mine about doing further professional qualifications, because as you can hear, I think it's probably not worth doing close to as many as Rowan if you're doing it solely for the benefit of your career, as I personally think that your time is better spent elsewhere, but Rowan clearly thinks differently. Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP104. In the show notes, there's details to contact me, links to the details of my masterclasses, and there's contact details in there for Maisie and Kevin at ProTax in case you want to get in touch with them. To make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, you can sign up for email notifications of all future episodes. Head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for the episode. I hope you've enjoyed the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.